and welcome back to a bonus episode of What the Forensics. My name is Rebecca, and I am joined here again today by the very lovely Journey and Nicole. Just before we get started, we did want to acknowledge that the places that we live and are currently recording from are the ancestral, unceded, and traditional lands of Indigenous peoples across Canada. In Halifax, we are in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. In Calgary, we are in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi and the people of the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including Chiniki, Bearpaw, and Wesley First Nations. And in Burlington, we are in the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabewaki, the Attawandaronk, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation Mississauga peoples. We've decided to switch things up this week, and in honor of September 30th, which is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, we are doing a bonus episode that's focused on the wrongful death of Indigenous individuals. Nicole will be telling us about the Highway of Tears, and Journey is going to be educating us today on Starlight tours. I would also like to note that there is a listener's discretion advised, as we do have detailed descriptions of missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as men being frozen to death. Without further ado, Nicole is going to get us started. Nicole, would you care to inform us on the tragedies that occurred on the Highway of Tears in Canada?
Yeah, I would love to get started on this. I do also want to acknowledge, even though we did a land acknowledgement, that the three of us are not Indigenous women. So we are going to try our best to be as respectful as we can, while also acknowledging the atrocities that Indigenous men, women, and their communities have faced and continue to face during this episode. We would like to also use kind of this platform as a way to educate others. And so we do welcome Indigenous members, if you are listening, to reach out to us, kind of just as an extra educational piece. If something doesn't sit right with you during this episode, please let us know. We would like to fix that right away. But we will try our best to be as respectful and educational as possible. And if you want a platform just to share and talk about, we would also love to have you here. To get started, though, the Highway of Tears started as a 725-kilometer stretch of Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada, and it's more specifically the stretch of highway that ran between Prince George and Prince Rupert, British Columbia. And this highway itself is kind of a piece of a larger national crisis surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls throughout Canada. But between 1989 and 2006, 9 young women either disappeared from this stretch of highway or were found murdered along the area. Of these 9 victims, 8 were Indigenous women. And 23 First Nations border this highway, and the area is characterized by quite a bit of poverty and has lacked proper public transportation up until about 2017, which I'll kind of get into. And so this just meant that hitchhiking was very common, and that was the frequent way of getting around for the most part. And in 1981, a conference was organized by the RCMP due to the increasing number of missing and murdered women found along Highway 16 and the other internal BC highways, and most of these cases remained unsolved. The Alberta and British Columbia police began noticing similarities in case files, especially including suspicious vehicles and people of interest. And around 40 detectives from both provinces actually attended this conference in 1981. And while nothing substantial really came from it, the RCMP homicide unit did create a project called EPANA in the fall of 2005, when they did notice similarities between the murders of Alicia Germain, Roxanne Tiara, and Ramona Wilson. It was intended to look further into the other missing and murdered women and girls along Highway 16. And so its goal was just to see if there were any more connections and involvement in that. So the EPANA, it's E-PANA. So the E comes from the E Division Criminal Operations, whereas Pana is the Inuit goddess of the soul, who is also known as the woman up there. And so she is someone who watches over the souls being transported from the middle world, which is Earth, to the upper realms, and so the sky. And there, Pana cares for the souls until they are ready to be reincarnated and sent back to Earth. I will say I am kind of confused as to why they used an Inuit goddess. The Inuit communities within Canada are across the northern regions. And so these include the Inuvialuit, the Northwest Territories and Yukon, the Nunavik, Northern Quebec, the Nunatsiavut, which is Labrador, and then Nunavut. I apologize if I really did not do a good job with those pronunciations. But I'm also like super undereducated when it comes to this. So there must have been a reason to have used an Inuit goddess. I'm not positively sure. If someone that knows would love to get a hold of us and inform us, I would be super grateful for that. But yeah, that's who they used for that. And so they did have 3 criterion when determining whether to include or exclude possible cases of missing and murdered women. And so these include, quote, the victim was involved in a high-risk activity that would expose them to danger, such as hitchhiking or being involved in street trade, which is prostitution. The victim was last seen or their body was discovered within 1 mile of British Columbia Highway 16, and they were female, end quote. So 2 years after the creation of Ipana, the number of women increased to 18 from the original 9. And this was when they increased the highway distance to 1,500 kilometers rather than the initial 725 kilometers. And this also then incorporated Highway 95 and Highway 5 into kind of their range of places. And this was done in October 2007. And by expanding the range of distance, they also expanded the date range because of this by an additional 20 years. So the murders then took place the murder and missing women were then between 1969 and 2006. From earliest to most recent victims that are acknowledged and included in this investigation, these include 27-year-old Gloria Moody, whose murder is still unsolved. She was a mother of 2, last seen leaving a bar in Williams Lake, BC on October 25th, 1969. Her body was found the next day. There's Micheline Père. She was murdered and her case still remains unsolved. She was 18 years old when she was last seen July 1970 along Fort St. John and Hudson's Hope Highway. Her body was found August 8th, 1970 near Hudson's Hope. There's Gail Weiss. She was murdered and her case still remains unsolved. She was 19 years old, last seen hitchhiking in October 1973, and her remains were found of April 1974. Bobby Jack Fowler was a person of interest in this case, but there was nothing conclusive that they could use to convict him to this crime, unfortunately, so that's why this case still remains unsolved. There's Pamela Darlington from Kamloops, BC. She was 19 years old when she was found in a local park in November 1973. Her case, again, remains unsolved, even though they did have a person of interest, and this, again, was Bobby Jack Fowler. He was suspected, but again, there was no conclusive evidence that they could use to convict him.
Are Pamela and Gail related in any way to have the same person of interest?
I don't think so. I never saw anything about relation. I just think he was like prowling in that area.
Okay.
At the time, because there's, I think there's one more victim too that he was of interest in. Yeah. There's another woman that he's involved with. So I think he was just like a repeat offender. I don't know if it's just these 3. I have a feeling he may have been involved in a lot more than that.
Yeah.
But I haven't come across any relation between the 2, unfortunately.
Okay.
Next, there was 15-year-old Monica Ignis. She was last seen in December 1974, walking along Highway 16. Her body was found a few months later, not far from where she was last seen, and her case still remains unsolved. There's also Colleen McMillan, who is 16 years old. She left to hitchhike to her friend's house, and her remains were found a month later. In October 2012, though, so this was 38 years later, DNA actually led RCMP to make Bobby Jack Fowler as the main suspect. Unfortunately, he did die in an Oregon prison. So unfortunately, they couldn't tie him to these cases once DNA was involved. He passed away in 2006. At the time, if DNA was around, hopefully they could have done something, but her case is considered unsolved still because they can't charge him since he's passed away, and you can't really charge a dead person. I don't know. But yeah. So Bobby Jack Fowler was not a great person when it comes to the Highway of Tears. Monica Jack is the youngest victim. She disappeared at only 12 years old in May of 1978 while riding her bike, and her remains were found in 1996. In 2014, 67-year-old Gary Taylor Handlin was charged for her murder, as well as the murder of 11-year-old Catherine Mary Herbert. Although he claims he didn't kill Monica, he had actually confessed to the crime during a conversation with undercover RCMP officers. So I can only imagine this was a sting operation that they had. And so that was kind of the case the prosecution, well, that's what the prosecution built their case on, was this confession. And so he was found guilty in January of 2019, which was 41 years after Monica had originally went missing.
That's crazy.
Yeah. It's just
also
shocking to see those numbers. Sorry, go ahead.
Bobby Jack Fowler is a serial killer and serial rapist who is active in the United States and Canada.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so he was arrested and convicted for rape, kidnapping, and attempted rape in Oregon in 1996.
Does it say how many victims he had?
1 confirmed, up to 20 suspected.
Wow. And 3 of those alone
so
are just from this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Great.
Actually, I think most of them are included in his potential victims.
Really?
Yeah. And Kim Rossmo from the Geographic Profiling, actually, he said that in his opinion, Fowler's not responsible for any of the deaths. But
interesting.
Who knows, really? Yeah.
Anyways, the next victim was Maureen Mosey. She was 33 years old when she was last seen hitchhiking near Salmon Arm, BC, May 8th, 1981. Her body was found near Highway 97. Shelley Ann Bascu, she was last seen May 3rd, 1983, near Highway 16 in Hinton, Alberta, and she was 16 years old. Next was Alberta Williams. She disappeared August 1989 at 24 years old. Her body was found several weeks later near Prince Rupert, BC, which is one end of that initial Highway of Tears range. And there's actually an 8-part podcast about her death that was released in 2016 by CBC News called Who Killed Alberta Williams? There's also 16-year-old Delphine Nicole. She disappeared June 14th, 1990. She was last seen hitchhiking on Highway 16 between Smithers and Telkwa, BC. Ramona Wilson, again, was 16, similar to the others, when she was hitchhiking to a friend's house in Smithers, BC on June 11th, 1994. Some of them, I feel like it kind of seems like there's patches that are related to each other, because like Delphine was hitchhiking between Smithers and Telkwa. Ramona was last seen, or she was going to Smithers. Like a lot of them, I know it's along the same stretch of highway, but I don't know.
Yeah, there were similar hunting grounds, kind of.
Yeah. She was part of the Gitten Max band, and her story is part of a documentary film called Finding Dawn. And this was produced and made by Métis filmmaker Christine Welsh about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. Ramona's remains were found along Highway 16 in April of 1995. So just under a year after she went missing. 15-year-old Roxanne Tiara disappeared November 1994 from Prince George, BC, and her body was found off of Highway 16 near Burns Lake. There's Alicia Germain. It also has that it's Alicia. There was 2 different spellings of her name. She was 15 when she disappeared while living in Prince George, BC. On December 9th, 1994, her body was found close to Highway 16 and unfortunately near an elementary school. Next is Alana Derrick. She was 19 years old and part of the Gittinyao band, and she disappeared October 7th, 1995. She was last seen at a gas station near Terrace, BC, traveling east on Highway 16 to her home in the Hazelton area, and she was enrolled in studies at Northwest Community College in Houston, BC. Next is Nicole Hoare, and that's Hoar. She was 25 when she disappeared on June 21st, 2002. She's from Alberta and was working in the Prince George area as a tree planter, and she was last seen hitchhiking from Prince George to Smithers on Highway 16. And this victim, a lot of people think her death, because she was part of the original 9, they believe that her death kind of kick-started the investigation because she was a white victim, whereas the other ones were Indigenous, and she was a little more well off than the others. So a lot of people believe that is what started, or at least kick-started, the investigation into these women.
I just wanted to say that to drive from Prince George to Smithers is 4 hours.
And they're hitchhiking? Oh my gosh.
I know. That's terrible.
I can't imagine that. Wait, okay, who was the other one? They were hitchhiking to most of them were just hitchhiking to their friends' houses. Where's Smithers and then Telkwa? Telkwa.
They're fairly close together.
Okay.
Roughly 11 minutes, an 11-minute drive.
Oh. Okay, so not 4 hours. Never mind then.
No, but yeah.
Okay, but still, 4 hours is...
That's quite a long time to be even just hitchhiking.
Yeah. I would be scared to hitchhike just 20 minutes up to the other end of Burlington to my mom's house or something.
Right?
Holy smokes. There's also 22-year-old Tamara Chipman. She disappeared on September 21st, 2005. She was hitchhiking on Highway 16 near Prince Rupert Industrial Park, and her home community was Morristown First Nation. The last recognized victim in Ipana is Isla Sarik Auger. She was 14 and a student at D.P. Todd Secondary School in Prince George, BC. She was last seen by her family on February 2nd, 2006, and her body was found February 10th, 2006, in a ditch along Highway 16, and she was about 15 kilometers east of Prince George. Although 18 are kind of recognized under this, there's been a lot of debate and controversy, over the total number of women and girls that have been missing or have been murdered. Some Indigenous groups do believe that the number well exceeds 40 throughout northern British Columbia. And 18 is kind of believed to be misleading because of how confined the space is, that geographic region they're looking at. Especially when they've made it a national crisis, to have just that small location in this investigation is a little concerning. And then additional things such as socioeconomic inequalities, systemic racism, and a lack of knowledge surrounding Indigenous issues are thought to be the cause of the limited resources and funding dedicated to investigating and solving these cases. And I also think they pose a huge barrier in properly investigating them. Like, sure, there's funding and limited resources and stuff like that. I unfortunately just think people aren't making the effort and it doesn't impact them, so they don't bother investigating it, which is the sad bit to it. And of these 18 total recognized women of this investigation, 10 are Indigenous. And while only 18 are included, the RCMP has reported that they've collected, quote, 750 DNA samples. They've conducted 2,500 interviews, investigated 1,413 persons of interest, and administered 100 polygraphs, end quote, since the creation of this investigation. I don't know if that's increased since then. I don't know why they're so specific with their numbers if they're not really doing anything with it, if they still only have 18 solved cases. Well, not even solved, 18 just like inclusion of cases, which is a bit odd to me.
Is EPANA still an active investigation?
From my understanding, yes.
Oh, wow. It's unfortunate that a lot of these cases took place before 1985 when DNA analysis was kind of started. So the investigators wouldn't have even known to swab or look for DNA evidence.
And like the thing that makes me think, though, is would they have? You know, like if that was available to them.
Yeah, the ignorance of the investigators anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially with Indigenous women, like would they have bothered kind of thing?
Yeah.
So they say they still have them like open, the case open, but this specific investigation is just ranged between 1969 and 2006. And I don't know if that's because they haven't just added any, like they haven't found any that meet those criteria, I guess, to be added in. But they do believe, they are confident that a single serial killer is not responsible for all the investigations. And they do have a task force of around 50 investigators and support staff. But they aren't, like I'm literally on the RCMP page right now, and they are not specific on whether they are still investigating it or not.
Just to chime in for a second, there is, at least as of this year, so it is still happening, there is a national action plan for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ plus people. I haven't read into it much, but they are still looking into it. They just...
Yeah, so I kind of... I'll touch on it quick, like soon too. There is a national inquiry about this. That would be separate from EPANA or EPANA. Sorry for the pronunciation. So those would be two separate things. And this investigation's kind of part of the larger national crisis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And so while prime suspects had been identified in the initial 1981 conference, and disappearances date back to 1969 now that have been related to the Highway of Tears, it's kind of extremely disheartening that women and girls, especially Indigenous women and girls, do continue to disappear and be killed. And it took them until 2005, almost a quarter of a century later, to put together an investigation looking into these women. That just kind of blows my mind a little bit. Actually, not a little bit, a lot.
It's disgusting, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's devastating, especially with like the Robert Pickton case where a lot of his potential victims were Indigenous women, but no one cared because they were part of a marginalized community. who weren't considered worth anything.
Yeah. I was thinking about that too while looking up the Highway of Tears and just kind of going over this episode. I wonder, like, how close would Picton have been to this region? Like, could that have...
Very far.
Oh, very far? Okay.
This is very northern BC, and he's very southern BC.
Okay. Never mind then.
Because I thought of that too.
Yeah. My brain was like, okay. But yeah, over the years, families and friends of the victims have put together many awareness campaigns, and they've done a lot of walks. So I kind of think of like the Terry Fox walk, like where you just walk and raise money. And so the most notable walk that they had happened in 2006, and they started at Prince Rupert and they walked all the way to Prince George.
That's incredible. That is a long walk.
Yeah, on March 30th, 2006. So that was the initial 725 kilometers. Let's see what Google Maps says how long that would take. Alone to drive is 8 hours.
Oh my goodness.
To walk is 145 hours.
Oh my gosh.
Which would be 6 days.
Wow.
They did that walk.
That is crazy.
That's incredible.
That is incredible.
So once they did arrive in Prince George, this kind of signaled the start of their 2006 Highway of Tears Symposium. And this is where victims' families and over 500 delegates attended. And their intentions were to raise public awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And of these 500 plus delegates, various sectors of society were represented, in addition to RCMP and government officials. And from the symposium, 33 recommendations were made that covered 4 main topics, and these include victim prevention, emergency readiness, victim family support, and community development. Unfortunately, very few of these recommendations were actually implemented, and I'll have a link to the actual report from the symposium up on our website if anyone wants to read further about it. And in 2015, so 9 years later, I don't know why was questioning that. 9 years later, Carolyn Bennett, why does that not seem right to me? In 2015, Carolyn Bennett, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Canada, at the time, she estimated that the national number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada was somewhere over 1,200 victims in 2015, which kind of exceeds the estimated 40 that they initially thought. So initially started at 9. 18 are recognized in this investigation, and a lot of Indigenous communities believed that number to be over 40. Now that estimation is now over 1,200. And so between December 2015 and February 2016, meetings were held with families of victims to try and determine kind of the scope of this national inquiry and that they were going to look into, as well as kind of the expectations. And so the national inquiry into... Sorry, go ahead.
Is that 1,200 in all of Canada or just on the Highway of Tears region?
They said that was a national number.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So all, but yeah, the 9, 18, then 40 were just the Highway of Tears. I personally think that's probably, there's more than that. But then, yeah, the national numbers over 1,200, believed to be over 1,200. They can't confirm that. But the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was launched on August 3rd, 2016. The terms of reference were outlined by 5 commissioners, and the inquiry committed $53.86 million over 2 years, quote, with the goal of producing recommendation on concrete actions to address the disproportionately high rate of violence towards Indigenous women and girls in Canada. The inquiry set out with a focus on prevention in addition to tackling issues of systemic and societal discrimination, end quote. So basically they wanted to look further into this and find out and possibly solve the why and who done it kind of thing. I mean, there's more than just a who, it's many people, but the national inquiry did lead some to believe real change was going to be on its way. I'd say there's been like some progress, like there is some discussion about it. There's been more discussion about it in the recent years. I still personally believe there needs to be more work put into it. And although a decade after the initial shuttle recommendation from the 2006 Highway of Tears Symposium, so like in that symposium, one of the third or many recommendations was make a shuttle. Like if all of these women are hitchhiking and going missing because of that, just add transportation. It wasn't until 2017 that only 3 new bus routes were created along Highway 16. Yeah.
That's despicable.
Mm-hmm. And to top that off, Greyhound stopped running their buses in that region by that time.
Why?
I can't quite remember. Let me see if I can quickly find the source that said it. I don't know. I really don't know. In 2018, so this is from the Canadian Encyclopedia regarding the Highway of Tears. It says that the Greyhound Canada announced in 2018 that it would stop servicing routes along the Highway of Tears as well as other stops across Canada. The mayor of Smithers has argued that the expanded local transit service, so the 3 that they added, does not make up for the services that Greyhound offered. And so the province's Minister of Transportation says she plans to work with the communities affected by the service disruption to ensure their needs are met. So I don't know. That was 2018.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the 3 buses was one of them. So one actively services between Smithers and Morristown. And then the other 2 service between like Burns Lake area in Smithers and then Burns Lake and Prince George area.
Oh, okay. So none of them actually make it to Prince Rupert.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, like, I guess it's good that they got buses, but there definitely needs to be more and they need to do it better.
Yeah, I agree. They have said, though, that about 5,000 people have used the bus routes in the first year of service, which, like, is good.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, maybe add more to help service more communities and you will get more use.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
And how accessible is this bus route? Is it super expensive? Like how easy?
I haven't looked into it.
Yeah.
I honestly haven't looked further into it.
Because it's one thing to have it and it's another thing to make it accessible and easily usable.
But yeah, then to have it as a super absurd amount of money in a poverty-stricken area would not be very wise.
No, and not nice at all.
But yeah, that's kind of all I have on Highway of Tears. There's so many other victims that I unfortunately couldn't discuss because I feel like we'd be here for a very long time. I do recommend, though, there are lots of like documentaries and resources to read about this. I do recommend, though, finding Indigenous resources. There is an organization, the Carrier Sakani Family Services. They have a Highways of Tears like organization and initiative. I recommend checking them out. And yeah, that's the Highway of Tears.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for sharing that story. It is definitely heartbreaking. I really feel like we could go on for a very long time discussing the inequalities of Indigenous communities and the effects that it has on their women and girls. I mean, just really briefly, as of like the 2022 Stats Canada survey, they found that 63% of Indigenous women have experienced physical or sexual assault in their lifetime.
Wow.
And obviously, there's not even words to describe how terrible that is and why
And that's
nothing's being
reported.
done.
That's only reported too.
Exactly. Because as we all know, there are many crimes that don't get reported for so many reasons.
That hurts. Like, I don't know. There's just no words for that.
Yeah, there really isn't. It's a very solemn topic, but I think it very much needs to be addressed. So thank you very much for telling us about it. And we also, as Nicole said, we'll also have resources on our website, but I'll mention those briefly again later. But moving on from that journey, I am very interested to hear you tell us all about these Starlight tours that were occurring in, I believe, northwestern Canada, was it?
Saskatchewan. Saskatoon specifically. Wow. Yes.
Kind of westernish.
Barely.
Yeah, okay, wow. That's actually closer than I remembered hearing it was. Okay, I am very interested. Journey, would you like to tell us about this?
Yes. So, like Rebecca said, I'm going to tell you about the Starlight tours, which are also referred to as the Saskatoon freezing deaths. So this refers to a series of suspicious deaths that occurred in and around Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in the early 1990s and 2000s. These quote-unquote tours were targeted to Indigenous individuals, most often men. So members of the Saskatoon Police Service would arrest Indigenous individuals for alleged drunkenness and or disorderly behavior. The police officers would then abandon them outside the city in the middle of the night in the middle of the winter. And the first known case of this happening was in 1976, which is horrifying. And it has been stated that as of 2021, no Saskatoon officer has been convicted for causing a freezing death, even if they've been charged with a related offense. So to begin, 3 individuals died from hypothermia: Rodney Naistus, Lawrence Wagner, and Neil Stonechild. Naistus and Wagner were killed in 2000 and found on the outskirts of Saskatoon. Inquiries into their death in 2001 and 2002 determined that they died due to hypothermia. So the first I'm going to talk about specifically is Neil Stonechild. He was found November 29th, 1990 in a field outside of Saskatoon by 2 construction workers. He was only 17 years old at the time of his death. A police investigation was started, and it was determined that he was last seen on November 24th, 25th in a residential area in the western part of the city. His autopsy was performed, and it was determined that he had died due to hypothermia. Later, it was confirmed that there was also marks that were likely caused by handcuffs. On the night of his death, the temperature had dropped to negative 28.1 degrees Celsius, which is incredibly cold. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I think someone said it's like negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit or something. So if that makes sense to you of how cold that is. So the Saskatoon Police Service was in charge of the investigation, and it was determined that there was no evidence of foul play after only 3 days. And so events that occurred during the investigation raised the question of, was Neil Stonechild in police custody that evening? And so it had been suggested that he had been picked up by police after a complaint was made against him of disorderly conduct at the apartment complex Snowberry Downs. Stonechild was with his friend Jason Roy, who was 16 that evening, and Roy told people that he had seen his friend Neil in the back of a Saskatoon police cruiser driving down Confederation Drive, and that he was bloody and calling for help. I don't know if I mentioned this, but Neil Stonechild was 17 when he died, so quite young. Newspaper reports were then released that the Stonechild family thought Neil's death hadn't been investigated adequately, and initially in the investigation, it was suggested that he had been killed by Gary Pratt, but there was no evidence to support this, so it was dismissed. I don't really know who Gary Pratt is. I tried Googling him, but nothing came up. However, he's related to Stonechild somehow, as they had a previous incident, apparently. It was then suggested that the 2 Saskatoon police officers who responded to the call about the disturbance had taken him from the scene of the crime or disturbance to the outskirts of the city and had abandoned him. It was then confirmed that Stonechild was drunk that night and had caused a disturbance at the Snowberry Downs apartment and also at a 7-Eleven store close to the apartment complex. The reason they were in the area of the apartment complex was because they were looking for Stonechild's ex-girlfriend, who was with her current boyfriend babysitting for her sister, who lived in the apartment complex. Fortunately, I guess, they didn't know which building or apartment she was in, so they just went around pressing buzzers and banging on the doors. Eventually, Jason Roy left after a bit of an argument with Stonechild, and then Stonechild continued searching on his own, somehow getting inside one of the buildings. He then went up and down the hallways, banging on all the doors individually. Somehow, he had managed to get into the right apartment building, and he was able to find his ex-girlfriend. They recognized that it was him knocking on the door and that he was very drunk, so they threatened to call the police if he didn't leave. Stonechild then mumbled an apology and left. His ex-girlfriend and who she was with did end up calling the police, but they never saw Stonechild again. Constables Bradley Sanger and Lawrence Hartwig responded to the call at 11:51 p.m. and stated that they were en route. The sequence of the next events are very important as well. It was concluded that the constables found Neil Stonechild shortly after 11:51 p.m. and that he was drunk, belligerent, and uncooperative, so they took him into custody. As they were driving down Confederation Drive, they came across Jason Roy at the 7-Eleven, where he went to warm up. When they asked Roy if they knew Stonechild, he said no, even though Stonechild was yelling from the back seat to tell them who he was and was asking for help. Roy then told the police that his name was Tracy Lee Horse, which is the name of his cousin. It was then confirmed that Constable Sanger conducted a CPIC search of the name Tracy Lee Horse at 11:56 p.m., and Roy was then released. There was then another CPIC search for the name Neil Stonechild made at 11:59 p.m., and then there was another search made at 12:04 a.m., and then nothing for 12 minutes. At 12:17 a.m., Constables Sanger and Hartwig declared Stonechild GOA, or gone on arrival, and cleared the call. There was then another call that happened only a block away from the apartments, but it took them 6 minutes to get there. So it was determined that in the 27 minutes between the initial search of Tracy Lee Horse and the arrival on the second call, it was enough time for them to drive Stonechild out to where he was abandoned and drive back. Unfortunately, the investigation into his death lasted only 3 days, and it was closed with no explanations or charges. And so it wasn't until the 2004 inquiry when his death was fully looked into. Constables Sanger and Hartwig were then fired on November 12, 2004. Charges weren't made because the inquiry was to only find the truth, not criminal responsibility, so they couldn't press charges in this case. There were a few complaints against the Saskatoon police officers during this time and about them transporting Indigenous people to remote locations around Saskatoon. And on January 28th, 2000, Daryl Knight, who was, I think, 33 at the time this happened, he left a party that was getting out of hand and immediately was picked up by 2 Saskatoon police officers. They grabbed him, cuffed him, and drove him out of town, leaving him on the side of the road in negative 20 degrees Celsius weather. Again, extremely cold. When they dumped him there, he said, quote, "I'll freeze to death out here, you guys," end quote. And the driver of the police car said, quote, "That's your effing problem," end quote, and then drove away. Luckily, Knight was able to walk across a snowy field to a power plant and was able to flag down the attention of a security guard and call a taxi. So he did survive this incident.
I don't know if I missed it. What was he wearing at the time? Because I feel like a lot of these men were just in like pants and a t-shirt, not prepared at all for this weather.
Yeah, I think it said he was wearing like a t-shirt with a jean jacket over top of it.
In negative 20. That's disgusting.
Right. And they just...
I'm so thankful, though, that he was close enough. Like, probably was a horrific walk to this power plant, but that he was close enough to find someone.
Yeah, unfortunately, the next two guys that I talk about, they were left in the same area and they did not survive. They didn't make it to the power plant. So I don't know how he was able to get there. They said, or one of the articles I read said that he walked 2 miles to get to the power plant.
Jesus. So it wasn't as
incredible.
Close. Yeah.
No, it's incredible that he even made it there.
Wow.
And so the very next day, another Indigenous man was found in the same area that Daryl was left. This man was Rodney Nastis, who was 25 at the time, and he was found frozen to death by a local politician who was out jogging. Nastis was out drinking with friends that night and was expected at his cousin's, who lived in the same building that Daryl Knight was picked up at. A couple days later, Daryl Knight and his uncle were pulled over for a seatbelt ticket when by Sergeant Bruce Ahart. Knight and his uncle kind of questioned him about what happened to Rodney Nastis, and the sergeant asked, why are they interested? They then told him what happened to Knight, and the sergeant asked if they filed a report about this incident, and Daryl tells him no because, quote, who's gonna believe me, end quote. Which is totally fair because you were just kidnapped by police officers and you're then expected to go to said police officers and report that incident.
That's terrible. Especially, the unfortunate thing is if he was a white male, they probably would have listened to him or at least humored him in the sense of being like, okay, tell me what happened that night.
And that's the thing. They wouldn't have even taken him out there to abandon him if he was a white man.
Yeah.
And so the next day, Ahart returned to Daryl's house and was like, I believe you. I'm going to help you kind of work through this. And so then the day after that, 29-year-old Lawrence Wagner was found in a field by the power station. He was a student at the First Nations University, and his family was told by police that he walked to the remote area and died of hypothermia. However, when his clothing was returned to his family, there were no shoes, just socks. But the socks weren't even worn through, so how could he have walked that far and not have any wear on his socks? And some RCMP officers actually took the same brand of socks and walked a certain distance, but they weren't able to make it near as far before the socks were completely destroyed. And it was actually his dad who kind of figured that out. He was like, no, this doesn't add up.
So are we thinking then that he was killed somehow and then covered up to make him walk?
No, we think that the police officers abducted him again and took him out there and just left him there. Oh. And he wasn't able to walk. And he just froze to death.
Okay. Jesus.
Yeah. So an RCMP task force was then started to investigate the deaths of Wagner and Nastis and the abandonment of Daryl Knight and some other related incidents. So they did take it over from the Saskatoon Police Service, who I don't think should have been investigating it to begin with. Constables Ken Munson and Dan Hatchin admitted to leaving Knight out in the cold that night. And during their trial, they claimed that Daryl had asked them to drop him off there in the cold. They were fired and convicted of unlawful confinement of Daryl Knight. They were found not guilty of assault and were sentenced to 8 months in the Provincial Correctional Centre. However, I believe they were out in 4 months.
What?
Yeah.
That's disgusting.
The maximum sentence that they could have gotten was 10 years.
And they got out in 4 months.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which I think that should be classified as attempted murder, not unlawful confinement.
Yeah.
But that's my opinion. Unfortunately, the RCMP task force concluded that there was insufficient evidence to lay charges in the deaths of Rodney Nastis and Lawrence Wagner. It is most likely that we will never know who is responsible for their deaths unless someone comes forward and admits to doing something. The abduction of Daryl Knight was what led to the inquiry of Stonechild's death in 2003. Constable Hartwig and Constable Sanger were fired, and the police chief did apologize to Stonechild's mother. However, Daryl Knight never received an apology, and to this day, he has difficulty communicating and hearing due to residual trauma from that night. I don't know if this is trauma from what happened to him, like mental trauma, or if it is actual like physical trauma just from being exposed to the cold for so long and having to walk for so long in almost negative 30-degree weather. Another death that was briefly mentioned was Lloyd Dustyhorn, who was found frozen to death the same month as Daryl Knight, Lawrence Wagner, and Rodney Nastis. It was also reported that Dustyhorn was arrested for public intoxication the day before his body was found. There have been some allegations about Starlight tours in the recent past, the most recent one, I believe, in 2018, but they have all been found, like, unfounded, kind of. And it's also a heartbreaking thought that if Daryl Knight hadn't survived, police would still be doing this and almost no one would be any wiser. And so if it wasn't for his survival, this atrocity wouldn't have been brought into public light so that things could be done about it. A lot of the Indigenous people were aware that their loved ones were disappearing and then turning up frozen, but no one knew why or what was going on, and no one was willing to look into it, which is extremely heartbreaking. And this pattern was seen as far back as 1976, when an officer in the Saskatoon Police Service was disciplined for taking a Native woman to the outskirts of the city and just abandoning her there. I couldn't find any more information about that case. What were you going to say, Nicole? You unmuted?
That's disgusting. I really don't know what else to say because I just can't think of the proper word to describe the atrocities of this. Yeah.
Well, this case is especially heartbreaking because the people you're entrusting with your safety are the ones killing them. And so, like, even with the Highway of Tears, like, I'm sure a lot of people wanted to do something, but it was the neglect of the police that wouldn't actually look into it. And so I just wanted to tell everyone to go watch the film that we have linked in our sources about the Starlight tours. It's where I got most of my information from, and it tells their stories in a way better way than I can. It's called Two Worlds Colliding, and I think that everyone should see it. It's by I think a local Indigenous filmmaker. Her name is Tasha Hubbards. It's incredibly well done. It's only 49 minutes long. And the last little bit that I have to say is that between 2012 and 2016, the Starlight Tours section of the Saskatoon Police Service Wikipedia page was deleted multiple times. The deletion of this information was actually discovered by a student, and they were able to learn the IP address of the computer that made the edit, and they traced it back to the Saskatoon Police Service. So an internal investigation determined that 2 of the edits did come from within the police service, but the removal of the information was not approved by the force. And they weren't able to pinpoint who the person was who did this because logs of the computer data are not kept longer than 30 days.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, despicable.
That's really screwed up.
Right?
They were probably like, I'm bored. We don't need this in our Wikipedia page. Let's just
they're probably so deeply ashamed of whatever happened. Yeah. They're like, we don't want people to know this, but you need to be very forthright with your history, especially when it's that.
Well, exactly. Like, they're so shameful about it that they're trying to hide history, essentially, which obviously isn't okay. Like, we can't tell history from just like from the perspective that we want to tell it from. If you want true history, then there's going to be negative aspects of it.
Exactly. And how unfair is that to the families of the victims?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what kind of bothers me a lot about history and how it's taught with such a like colonialist white lens.
Yeah, it's very whitewashed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so like it made me so angry because who do you trust when the people you're supposed to trust are the people committing these terrible acts? And so I can't even imagine how terrifying it is to be someone who's not able to trust anyone, specifically the people who are in charge of your safety. And a couple of my articles said that Indigenous students in Saskatchewan are more likely to be stopped by police than non-Indigenous students, whether or not they're committing a crime or any form of illegal activity. And they're more likely to receive harsher sentences than non-Indigenous people in Saskatchewan. Another fact is that Indigenous people in Saskatchewan make up 5% of the total population, but 50% of the prison population, which is just heartbreaking.
I forget the fact. Sorry, I was just trying to look it up quickly. The adoption statistics. Have you seen those about Indigenous children?
No, I haven't.
It's very similar to the jail stats.
Yeah.
52.2% of children in foster care are Indigenous, but only 7.7% of the child population in Canada are Indigenous children.
Oh my gosh.
And this is in 2016. So this means that 14,970 out of 28,665 foster children in private homes under the age of 15 are Indigenous.
Oh my goodness.
Even though only and this was 2016 stats, so I'm not sure. This comes from Stats Canada, but I'm not sure how much that's changed.
Yeah.
And a 2011 National Household Survey shows that 38% of Indigenous children in Canada live in poverty, compared to 7% for non-Indigenous children.
There are so many statistics regarding living on a reserve or being an Indigenous person that really demonstrate the systemic racism we still have in our country, despite having, like, we're releasing this on September 30th. We're obviously recording a couple days before, but just for example, like when I was researching COVID-19 for my thesis, like realizing how so many Indigenous communities don't have or have very limited broadband internet, which doesn't, like, a lot of people think anyways that internet is a privilege. But when you think about how many communities don't and how reliant we are on the internet now, like it impacts every aspect of your life. And there's just so many more inequalities than just internet that they're experiencing that people just seem to forget about, because we're like, oh, well, there's truth and reconciliation going on in the government right now, and we have this national day. But I feel like so many people are still treating this national day as just a holiday, when I think we should be using it to actually recognize why we have this day.
Exactly. And I feel like even a lot of reserves don't even have the basic necessities. They don't have clean water. They don't have power. They're so, like, deprived and kind of almost cut off from the rest of civilization almost.
Well, I was just recently, so with the work that I'm doing right now, each site that we're on, we need to have Indigenous monitors, just if we do find Indigenous artifacts, that we are sure, like, we're making sure that we're handling them with the most respect and care that we can, and we get the knowledge and education from these Indigenous monitors. But I was working a site, and one of the monitors was saying that she's got some land on the reserve right now, but to put in, like, cable, it was like over $4,000 to do.
Wow.
Just to connect her house, because of, like, how far back she is and where on the reserve they are. And, like, I don't know what that compares to being in the city and being white, but I have a feeling people aren't paying $4,000 to hook up
Definitely not
internet or cable.
No.
I will say too, I know we're going to post sources and resources to get a hold of. I highly recommend, I'm doing it right now, so I'm not far enough to give, like, a full review on it, but there's a online course on Coursera, it's called. Coursera, and they have an Indigenous Canada course where they basically give you, it's like a class on Indigenous Canada and everything about it, essentially. It's a free course. You can pay to get a certificate in it. I am unfortunately broke at the moment, so I am doing the free one. But I would love to go back when I have the money to support and do the paid one. I really recommend that as a source for the moment. Yeah.
Okay, well, Journey and Nicole, thank you both for telling us about these very heartbreaking cases that really are still happening today. I know there is more evidence of murdered and missing Indigenous women cases occurring today, but I know we're not really seeing Starlight cases, at least publicly. But just thank you guys for bringing awareness to these topics that very much need to be discussed, because I think there are a lot of people in Canada that might have heard of the terms, but maybe didn't actually understand or know the full scope of them. And as you guys said, like, there are resources that come directly from Indigenous peoples that can tell it better than we can, but we're just trying to kind of open the door to help you explore more resources and learn more about the systemic racism that is still actively occurring today in Canada. So yeah, thank you guys very much. We did want to share a couple resources. They're all on our website under our sources for this episode. I'm just going to list a couple of the associations and stuff that we have listed, but all of the email and like call information is available there if you do feel the need to reach out to them. So we do have resources such as the Native Women's Association of Canada Elder Support Line, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Hope for Wellness Helpline. We have information from the Urban Native Youth Association of the Native Youth Health and Wellness Center, and also things such as the Native Counseling Services of Canada. Of course, if you need to reach out to any of these for the sake of your mental health or you want to learn information, then that is fantastic. But we really urge you to look into the sources that we shared today, and also into the creators, the Indigenous creators that have shared these stories from their own experiences. Yeah, so we are not going to do a joke today. We're not going to share social media because that just doesn't feel right when we are doing a topic that is very obviously prevalent in the country we're living in. It's a very serious topic. So with that being said, this has been another episode of What the Forensics. We really thank you for listening. We hope you found this episode very informative, and we hope that it's kind of opened your view into what is still occurring in Canada and what we need to figure out how to make a real change. It's not only the government that can make this change, but us as people, we can do something about it, urge organizations, urge governments to genuinely try and change the systemic racism that's occurring. We will see you in our next episode. We, again, just really hope you learned something new in this episode. We kind of gave you some sort of information to dig deeper, and we really appreciate all of you listening today.
Just a reminder to everyone that we are not professionals in the forensic science field. We are just students who are learning and want to share what we are learning with our listeners. We're trying to give you the most accurate information, but we are human and we can make mistakes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you next week. 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 Hope to see you next week.